Okay. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you have seen the other videos so far. So we've made it through our Renaissance lectures, and now we have two lectures about the Baroque. So this one is about the Baroque in Italy and Spain, and then the next one is about the Baroque in Northern Europe. So first, let's talk about the word Baroque. You've maybe heard this word before. The Baroque is the period that follows the Renaissance, obviously, which is why we're talking about them in this order. It's kind of a weird word. Historians aren't 100% sure about its origin, but one of the theories, and the one that I kind of like that sort of makes sense to me, is that the word comes from this Portuguese word, and the Portuguese word is barroco, so B-A-R-R-O-C-O. And the word barroco in Portuguese is a very specific word. It means pearls that are irregular and imperfect, basically, like there's something a little bit wrong with them. They have a little irregular shape, they aren't perfectly round, etc. So barroco is kind of a word for something like a pearl that's beautiful, but it isn't quite right. It isn't quite perfect. So why would this be attached to an art movement? Well, we first see the word Baroque crop up in the 18th century, and it's being used by critics who don't think as much of the artwork from this time period, okay? So it's critics who are talking about the 17th century art and belittling it a little in comparison to the art that preceded it in the Renaissance. So calling it Baroque, if it's a derivative of this Barroco Portuguese word, is basically saying it's kind of good, it's kind of like the art from the Renaissance, but it's not quite right. It's not as perfect. It's not as well done. So it's actually kind of a derogatory term. The negative connotation that was originally associated with the word most likely has diminished over time, but the word has stayed as the name for this time period. That kind of thing happens in art history. We'll talk about fauvism later. It's a word that came from a critic as a derogatory word, and then the movement gets labeled that, and it isn't seen as negative anymore. So this happens sometimes. Okay, so, and then there's a very bad art history joke. It's kind of a dad joke, so I apologize in advance, that still circles occasionally, and I'm going to inflict it upon you now. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it, which is terrible. I'm sorry. Okay, so anyway, there's sort of a negative connotation with the word Baroque originally when it's formed. So what's happening in Europe at this time? What are we doing history-wise? What's the cultural context? The Peace of Westphalia is signed. This is in 1648. And this basically, it does a lot of things, but for our purposes today, it formally validates religious freedom. So it basically says, Protestants, Catholics, you can both exist. There can be two versions of Christendom. That's fine. So that happens. So the Protestants and the Catholics are both allowed to be. But the Catholic Church is still like really wary of Protestantism. They're still pretty concerned with how popular it's become. Okay, so they're a little weirded out by this. They have a bunch of different councils to discuss this matter. One of them is the Council of Trent. At the Council of Trent, they kind of double down on this idea that art is good. We want art in our churches. We think that religious art is good. It will help get the word of Catholicism and Christianity out to the people. And so, as I said before, the Protestants weren't as keen on that. So out of the Council of Trent, one of the things that comes out of it is this idea from Catholicism that art is kind of on their side. They're pro-art. So the Catholic Church particularly, continues to be a big patron of the arts in the Baroque period. All right, let's look at our first artist. So this is one of the more famous artists from this period. His first name is also Michelangelo. So this is Michelangelo Merisi. We know him as Caravaggio. So you've maybe heard of Caravaggio. He's an interesting guy. Okay, so a few lectures ago I talked to you about Fra Filippo Lippi, the guy who was an embezzler even though he was a friar, and he was a nun kidnapper, that guy. So Caravaggio is also a criminal. He's a little bit more serious of a criminal. He's actually a murderer. Um, so he's kind of a rough guy. Uh, so he was a gambler. He liked to hang out in taverns. He liked to drink. And then he would get too drunk and he would start fights. He would get into these big brawls with people. And in one such case, he possibly accidentally killed this guy whose last name was Tomasoni. So he kills a man named Tomasoni in a brawl that was probably a dispute over gambling of some kind, over sports betting or something. So that's not great. So he gets exiled to Naples after that. Up until that point, his patrons had always kind of been able to get him out of trouble. But he's a rough character. He's a troublemaker. He's not a guy you'd want to fight. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. He's born in northern Italy. He develops this very distinct style. He was also, like how I talked about Michelangelo, not this Michelangelo, the other Michelangelo, being a painter's painter, an artist's artist, and being really, really kind of loved and admired by his peers. Caravaggio was the opposite of that. So he liked to kind of talk a lot of smack, essentially. And he sort of refused to acknowledge the influence of the masters that came before him, and he refused to emulate styles of other artists, which made him sort of unpopular. One artist of the time called him the Antichrist of artists, which is maybe a little extreme, but he didn't get along with people, essentially, is what I'm saying. But because he's sort of self-isolated in some of these ways, he becomes this master of his own style. And one of the things that he does is he's a pioneer of what we call tenebrism. Tenebrism used to be called chiaroscuro. He's still associated with chiaroscuro. When I was studying art history of 5,000 years ago, that is what we called it. We didn't call it tenebrism. But today it's tenebrism. So this is this idea of extreme shadow and extreme highlights, lights and darks, being juxtaposed right next to each other to create a lot of drama. So Caravaggio is the master of that technique, and utilizing the high contrast of light and dark to create dramatic scenes. So we know quite a bit about his life, but a lot of what we know is from police records, is from following his movements based on where he was arrested, which is sort of interesting. He lived with a cardinal named Del Monte for a while, and so he was steadily employed by Cardinal Del Monte. And Cardinal Del Monte he hired him to be kind of like a court painter, but just in his house, essentially. And he got him out of trouble a lot. He would bail him out kind of on the reg, and he was very important and influential because he was a cardinal. It's a high status position within the church. So one of the things Caravaggio did a lot was it was illegal to carry weapons into taverns. You weren't allowed to take your sword with you, but he always took his sword into the tavern, and so he was getting arrested for that a lot, and then for getting drunk and getting into fights. So Cardinal Del Monte gets him out of a lot of trouble. The cardinal also helps him get other commissions from other important people. And one of the commissions he helps him get is for this painting, The Calling of St. Matthew. So this was painted in 1597 through 1601, and it's very exemplary of his paintings, a lot of his paintings of the time. So one of the things that he's really known for, other than tenebrism, which is that play of light and dark, is employing naturalism. And in this case, what I mean by naturalism is he takes these important holy figures and biblical stories and he makes it look everyday. He doesn't make it look like something to be exalted. He doesn't make Christ look super holy, for example. In this painting, Christ is the guy with his hand up in the air, gesturing from the corner. You can just kind of see his face and his arm, basically. And if you look above his head, there's a slight little line that kind of indicates a halo. So that's the only sort of nod towards the fact that this is someone holy and exceptional. Otherwise, it just sort of looks like a normal scene of people hanging out in a tavern. If we look closely at this, and at his other paintings, we see that these figures are not idealized, the settings are commonplace. And that's very typical of his work. So when we look at Christ's hand and the gesture it's making and the shape of his hand, we do see that he has a little reference here. So if you remember when we looked at the Sistine Chapel, at Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel paintings, and the most famous scene from that is God creating Adam. So God, remember, reaches his hand straight out to Adam, and Adam kind of gestures his finger like this, so it's pointing down kind of under God's arm where the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus were kind of snuck in there. Well, the shape of Jesus's hand here mimics exactly the shape of Adam's hand in that composition. It's thought that this was intentional because the church kind of considered Christ to be the second Adam in a lot of ways. So this is a parallel that gets drawn a lot. So Adam is responsible for the fall. Adam and Eve are responsible for the fall, and then Christ is the redemption. So drawing this visual parallel is the kind of thing that churches liked, because that could then become a sermon tying in these visual cues, right? Okay, so this is the calling of Matthew. So the story that's being portrayed here is Christ comes and he calls Levi the tax collector to come and serve him. Levi the tax collector is very surprised by this because, you know, he thinks as a tax collector he's a sinner, da 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 da. So he's the guy in the black hat that's kind of pointing at his chest going, me? He looks very surprised. Levi, after he goes and follows Christ, changes his name to Matthew. That's why it's called the calling of Matthew. So what's interesting here is the way he uses the light to show us what's really important and what's happening in this image. So in Baroque paintings, Caravaggio paintings, we have the light and dark kind of directing us. We also have the gesture of the hand, a lot of the diagonal gestures in the painting point to him. The literal line in the background of where the light comes down and hits Levi's face points us directly to him and shows that that's Matthew, that's who's being called. The idea of these compositions that are very dynamic, having a lot of strong vertical lines in terms of where your eye is directed and how your eye moves around the painting, is another feature of the Baroque that we see quite a lot. Okay, so I do have a little content warning here, and one of these is also in your quiz. So just to warn you, they're oil paintings, but I still they're pretty violent, so I like to throw a little heads up before them. So we're going to look at two paintings of the same subject matter, which is Judith slaying Holofernes. So I'll tell you about that story when we look at it, but just so you know, you're going to see in the next image a woman beheading a man. It's a painting, it's not like a graphic photo, but just heads up. Okay, so this is a painting by Caravaggio, and it is Judith beheading Holofernes. So we see the play of the light and shadow of tenebrism is one of the things that creates drama in the Baroque style. We see that used very well here. Another choice that's common in Baroque imagery is the subject matter creates drama. Like paintings are often of more active subjects. So there's not just in the composition in terms of all the diagonal lines that are moving your eye around, but this is also something that's kind of crazy what's happening. I mean, we're seeing a very violent act being depicted here. And of course, this is well before television or anything like this. So this is pretty wild, right? So this idea of dynamic action in paintings is very popular at the time. Also, this idea of something kind of grotesque like this becomes pretty popular because, like I said in the beginning, the Catholic Church is interested in getting people engaged and getting them interested in their content, basically. So this is the kind of imagery that really draws your attention. It's hard to not look at. So in the Baroque, we see the combination of naturalism, which is this idea of kind of ordinary people in ordinary settings. We see dramatic light, tenebrism. We see a dynamic subject matter that is sometimes quite violent that really engages the viewer. So this is Caravaggio's version of, it's called Judith beheading Holofernes. And then we have this version of the same subject matter. This is called Judith and Holofernes, and it is by a different artist who was very influenced by Caravaggio. Let's talk about this story, as I haven't really told you. In case you are not familiar with the story of Judith and Holofernes, this is a fairly popular subject matter at the time. We see a lot of paintings that portray this and some sculptures. There's a sculpture that is commissioned by the Medicis that portrays the same thing. So Judith killing Holofernes, it's from the apocryphal scripts, so non-canonical. They're not part of the actual Bible, but they're some of the other material that was contemporaneous with the writing of the Old Testament, where the Old Testament comes from. So there's other stories that aren't in the actual Bible that are kind of in tangent to it, essentially. So this is one of those stories from the Book of Judith. Okay, so let's see. Nebuchadnezzar is a king in the Old Testament, in Old Testament times. He sends his general Holofernes to wipe out the Jews. In the Old Testament, there's a lot of people trying to wipe out the Jews. That happens a lot. It kind of happens throughout history. It's unfortunate, problematic. People are always trying to wipe out the Hebrew people. So Holofernes is the general, and he goes in and he's going to take out all these people, and he's doing a pretty good job of it. He besieges Bethulia, and the Jewish people are losing hope. They didn't expect this siege. They're being attacked. They're not doing very well. But then the hero of our story, the beautiful widow Judith as a name literally means Lady Jew, by the way. So Judith sneaks into the Syrian camp where their general Holofernes is, and he is enchanted by her beauty, so she kind of seduces him. She gets him very drunk, and then he passes out, and she cuts off his head. And she takes his head back to her people and shows it, and they rally, and they drive out the Assyrians, and so they are not destroyed by the Assyrian army. So that's the story. Okay, so let's look at the composition here. So let's look back. So here we have Caravaggio. So we have, this is a little bit more tentative of Judith, right? She's sort of like holding his hair, but she's kind of got her arm like this, and like she doesn't necessarily want to get in there too tight. Like she's afraid of getting blood on her dress or something almost, right? So it's dynamic still, and we have, it's pretty gruesome. We have the strong diagonal of his arms and collarbone there. We have the diagonal going up from her arm to her maidservant's face. And then we have this triangular drapery shape. So we have some dynamic lines, but look at Artemisia Gentileschi's portrayal. It's much more dynamic. We have an inverted triangular composition here. This Judith is not afraid to get bloody. She's got her sleeves rolled up. Her maidservant is helping her hold him down, and she's getting in there, and she's got like some muscle in behind it. But you can definitely see the influence, right? So very dramatic lines, very dynamic kind of diagonals happening, dramatic subject matter. And then look at the play of light and dark. We have these really strong, glaring, bright highlights right up against very dark shadows in the background. So this is clearly a direct influence. Okay, so let's talk about Artemisia a little bit. So Artemisia Gentileschi. If you looked at the notes for this part of the module, one of the things in the timeline is that she becomes a internationally famous artist. She is quite famous in her own time. So the things that she takes from Caravaggio are the naturalism, the tenebrism, and this interest in dramatic subject matter, or sometimes dark subject matter. Artemisia Gentileschi is born in 1563. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, is also a painter. He briefly is the painter of the court painter of the King of England, King Charles. He trains her, so women couldn't go to be official apprentices, so she's trained by her father, who's a painter. For a while, he claims her work as his own, and then later art historians accidentally mistakenly identify some of his work as her own, as was common. A lot of work isn't originally attributed to women, but in her own time, she is successful as a painter. So she's successful in Florence, Venice, Naples, and Rome, and she is not someone who gets into brawls and gets banished from places. So she is actually kind of, as she sort of spreads the style of Caravaggio further than he did, even, because she moves around a lot doing commissions in different courts. She has a lot of patrons, and she's a little better liked. Essentially, she isn't trying to like murder people and brawl. So her style, she kind of does a lot to spread Caravaggio's style and what he developed and the idea of tenebrism around. Let's see. Okay, so this is one of her paintings. Let's look at another one. So this is another painting of hers. This is Jael and Sisera. Jael is a woman in the book of Judges. She's another Jewish woman who has to kill a military man to save her people. This is a common theme. And these depictions of women committing violence against men are a lot of the things that Artemisia paints. She paints quite a few of these, not exclusively this, but she's a survivor of rape, and so this is the kind of subject matter that you see from her. But you can see here that she has the same kind of ideas as Caravaggio in terms of the tenebrism, the light and dark, and in terms of the way her figures look, right? I mean, this is a figure from the Bible, but she just kind of looks like a person, right? This is a really interesting painting by her, and I show you a few of her works because she's very interesting. So this is her self-portrait. La pittura is the Italian name for it, which means the painter and actually the allegory of painting. So this is her self-portrait as the allegory of painting. She was the first woman admitted to Florence's Accademia della Disegno. So the Academy of Design does take her eventually, and she is admitted to that school, which is a big deal. In addition to her many paintings, she left behind a lot of letters. From those, we know that she wasn't treated super well by some of her patrons. She kind of had to haggle her price back and forth with a lot of people. But it's really interesting because we have these first-hand documents that sort of tell us some things about her life. She painted this particular painting while she was in England with her father, when her father was the court painter for Charles I, who was the King of England. And this was part of Charles I's collection. So this is interesting, painting herself, not just as a self-portrait, but that she is emulating painting itself. Cesare Ripa wrote a handbook in 1593 called Iconoglia. So basically, this is about the iconography of images. So how different kinds of images are portrayed. Until the 16th century, poetry and music had personifications. That means them being displayed as people with specific attributes to represent them. This was a common thing in classical depictions, but painting did not have one of these allegorical personifications. So in Ripa's book, because painting was so elevated as a skill and as an intellectual pursuit in the Renaissance, he adds painting as one of the iconographies that he describes, and he describes it very much like this painting looks. So we know that she was doing this quite intentionally. So she represents herself like painting is represented in his book. He describes painting as, a beautiful woman with disheveled hair, painting with her brush in one hand and her palette in the other. She wears a gold chain with a mask pendant, because masks imitate faces and painting is the art of imitation. So if you look closely, you see that she has a gold chain with a little mask pendant on it. So she's directly painting herself as painting. And you'll notice the background is blank. We don't see the canvas she's painting on is blank because she's not meant to be representing herself at a moment in time, painting something specific. She is representing herself as painting in general, kind of as the spirit of painting. The chains and the necklace also have meaning. The idea of the chain is the link between pupil and master throughout the generations of painters. It's also pretty incredible in terms of self-portrait because of the composition. You notice the way her arms are, the way your eye moves around the entire composition instead of her just sitting still and looking directly at us. It's a pretty interesting in terms of portraiture goes. This is another painting of hers, the Penitent Magdalene. So this is Mary Magdalene. And I just included this one to show that she doesn't always paint very violent things. So this is an example of tenebrism and the way that she uses that in less dynamic composition, so in less dramatic composition. So here we have the Penitent Magdalene. So she's relaxed, she's kind of sleepy. We have her attributes, which are her long hair, which is generally red. You have the jar of her ointment, which she anointed Christ's feet with. So we know this is Mary Magdalene. And even though she's sleepy and there's no real action happening in this painting, because of the high contrast of the light and shadow, and because of the composition, the way we still have that kind of inverted triangle, our eye moves around. There's a lot of interest in the painting. So she's kind of a master in terms of her ability to translate dynamism in composition and the treatment of light and shadow. Okay, let's look at somebody else. So this is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Bernini is my favorite sculptor of the time. He's quite famous. If you are ever in Rome and go to Vatican City, St. Peter's, there's the huge circular colonnade in front of St. Peter's that has many, many statues. Bernini designed that and composed the sculptures. He's pretty amazing. He's another one of those, well, he's not in the Renaissance, he's in the Baroque, but he's kind of a Renaissance man in that he has a lot of skills. He's an architect, he's a painter, he's a playwright, but he's most famous for being a sculptor. This is in Santa Maria della Vittoria, which is in Rome. Specifically, it's in the Cornaro family chapel. So within churches, some wealthy patrons, wealthy families had their own designated chapels for their families to go pray in. So if you look at the architecture of a church, you have the nave, that's the long area where all the people sit, and then radiating off of the nave and the main apse in the back, you have specific chapels. So this family has their own chapel. They wanted their chapel, the art that they commissioned Bernini to do, they wanted it to be dedicated to Teresa of Avila. She was a prophet who had visions. She was a nun, and she received these visions from God, sometimes in her sleep, sometimes when she was awake, and she wrote about them. She lived from 1515 to 1582, so she lived pretty recently in terms of when this was constructed. She had only very recently been canonized, been made a saint at this time. She's an important figure in the Counter-Reformation. She was depicted quite a lot during this time period. In her mystical writings about her visions from God, she describes the sweet pain of an angel stabbing her repeatedly with an arrow. We'll talk about Freud later when we talk about psychoanalysis and modernism, but it's a pretty interesting religious image to have a beautiful angel stabbing you repeatedly with an angel and it resulting in ecstasy and sweet pain. Anyway, so this is a gorgeous sculpture. I've stood in front of this and it moved me to tears. It's quite beautiful. Bernini's mastery of marble is incredible. You look at the softness of the face, you look at the distinction between the way the clouds are formed and the way her skin is and the way the material folds. I mean, it's a really incredibly beautiful sculpture. It's very moving in person. One of the things that this calls back to again is this Counter-Reformation idea that the recreation of religious experiences will help inspire devotion and piety in the people that see them. So that's one of the reasons that she's an exciting figure, because she was just this normal mortal person who received these visions and then was elevated to sainthood. So picking dynamic things like this as subject matter was common in Counter-Reformation work commissioned related to the church. And the idea, again, is that seeing something like this, it's like, oh, I want to have that experience. It's kind of a literal, I'll have what she's having kind of gesture. Is the idea that people would be inspired and want to come over to Catholicism because of these kind of images. Okay, let's go to Spain. So the foremost Spanish painter in the Baroque is Diego Velasquez. Velasquez is born in 1599. He trains as an artist in Seville. King Philip IV, the King of Spain, discovers Velasquez when he's quite young, and he kind of commandeers him to be his court painter. He's so impressed with his skill that he makes him this fantastic job offer to be his like #1 court painter, and also to be the chamberlain of the palace. What the chamberlain does is he's in charge of the art collection, basically. So he kind of maintains the collection of art and helps advise on what art to procure. It's a very prestigious role. So he's not just the #1 court painter, he's also the chamberlain, so he has this very official title. So he stays in Madrid, where the palace is, for the rest of his life, except for he takes some visits to Italy, but he has this pretty sweet gig. He visits Rome from 1648 to 1651, and then when he returns to Madrid, he does this painting. So he's clearly influenced by things he sees happening in the Baroque in Italy. So the setting is his studio at the palace. One of the princes dies, and the king takes some of his chambers and makes them into chambers and a studio for Velasquez. So we're in his studio. Then we have the young princess in white in the center there. That's the young Princess Margarita. So the other people have all been identified. We have her two kind of ladies in waiting kind of people, maids in waiting. We have the large dog in the foreground. We have these two individuals over to the side are listed as the princess's favorite dwarves, which was apparently a thing, which seems very odd to us in contemporary times. But they were kind of part of her entourage, basically. So this is a really complicated image. Velasquez portrays various degrees of reality within this room, right? So we have Velasquez, the painter, is here to the left of the handmaiden, and we see him standing in front of a giant canvas. The giant canvas that he's painting is probably the canvas that we're looking at. Okay, so he's most likely painting this whole scene from a large mirror. So we have that perception of reality where we're looking at the formation of the thing we're looking at, which is kind of wild. We also have in the background painted images on the wall that are portrayed, and we have a mirror. So when you look at the mirror that's kind of right over the princess's head, those are her parents. That's her dad, Philip, who's the king, and her mom, Mariana, who's the queen, are depicted, reflected, but they're being reflected back again from the larger mirror that this is being painted from. So these degrees of reality and this idea of depicting all of these things in one image is pretty revolutionary at the time. It's a very conceptual idea, and it's not the kind of arrangement or subject matter that we have seen up until this point. Part of what makes it known that this is very intentional is the way he expands the depth outward in both directions. So in a typical court painting, he would just have painted the princess, maybe her entourage, right? So it would have been more zoomed in, more like that. But instead, he shows us the ceiling, he shows us the back of the canvas that he's working on, he shows us way more information about the room than normally would have been seen. So we know that he was thinking about things in terms of composition and in terms of layering reality. So it's kind of a behind-the-scenes kind of painting, basically. He also uses value quite a bit differently than his peers at the time. So he doesn't just have the stark highlights and shadows that we see in Caravaggio and Gentileschi. He has a full range of muted grays. And he's using these grays to tone all the colors in each of the garments and each of the flesh tones so that he has an almost photographic kind of quality of color, which is very unusual and is a very complicated way to paint. So he's glazing in all these different value layers as he's painting this piece and being very careful about how he portrays it. So he has this gradation of lights and darks. And the work, the way it's composed so that we see so much of it and we see these different kinds of images makes the viewer aware of looking. So it makes you aware that you are looking at an image and at the different types of images of reality that exist, which is pretty conceptual and wild for this time. It's really a kind of modernist sort of approach to painting. So Velasquez is quite important, and he's quite conceptual, and he's kind of breaking down some walls between viewer and painter that have not been done up until this time. There's a closer image. You can also see in this one the way he's using his brush strokes is slightly abstracted. So it's slightly, there are areas that are slightly out of focus, like maybe they're moving. You can see the way he uses focus in terms of perspective, where the images that are on the wall are darker and much less clear. The image in the mirror is slightly more clear because that is more direct reality being reflected back. And then the most clear are the actual people in the image. So this is another way that he's conveying these different layers of reality to us. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is this painting. So Velasquez is a big deal. He's very prestigious. He's the court painter, #1 court painter, and the chamberlain, so he's in charge of collecting. So he's kind of untouchable in the Spanish Baroque. Like, nobody's as famous as him. But there is one guy that you could kind of make the argument that he has more of an influence and lasting impact in painting than Velasquez, and that is this guy. This is Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. Murillo is responsible for this image, which becomes kind of the canonical image of the Virgin Mary. So basically that's what he's most famous for, is he comes up with this idea of how to portray her, where she has white, she has a blue mantle, she's kind of humble and young and beautiful, and this idea of her floating among the angels and the cloud is the idea of the Immaculate Conception happening in this very beautiful, soft, glowy light kind of way. And this image of Mary becomes the template for the next hundreds and hundreds of years. It's still kind of the way we think of her being portrayed. And this is where her attributes and the way that she looks comes from this painting. So, though Velasquez technically and conceptually is kind of the guy from the Spanish Baroque, this particular painting, and he did a series of paintings similar to this, from Murillo becomes this other template that's used throughout Western Catholicism as the portrayal of the Virgin Mary, which is pretty interesting. So this is the painting that started that particular kind of imagery. Okay, so that is the Baroque in Italy and Spain. In our discussions, several of you have other artists and other artworks from this time period, so we will learn more about those in the discussion. Okie dokie.